I'm Michael Hartung. I'm in New York City in the Hamilton Heights area. I'm an actor by trade, but I've always considered myself an activist and an advocate for my community. So I'm happy to be here. I think this is actually a beautiful mix of both my passions.
Michael, that's so good to hear. And speaking of being an activist in your community, how has this COVID moment affected how you view your local community?
Usually when I'm walking around outside, everyone's wearing a mask, especially when we're indoors at a grocery store or CVS or something, everyone's wearing a mask and taking it very seriously. So it makes me proud of my neighborhood in that way. And then also seeing the local businesses, how they've handled this, if it's the restaurants or the small businesses, the small shops up here. The restaurants, like all of New York City, have gotten really creative, and actually the restaurants up here are gorgeous and have really created amazing outdoor spaces. So I have pride for that too. The neighborhood up here has really been responsible in how they are tackling this pandemic, but also really resourceful.
That's fantastic to hear how your particular neighborhood is pulled together. How do the Black Lives Matter uprisings connect to climate change and environmental injustice?
Something that I've been doing is looking into the composting system. Composting is something that I was doing a lot before the pandemic happened, and then right when it hit, the city cut all of the composting budget. So I started looking into what that was about. And then for people that don't know, because I didn't before I started looking into this, 34% of New York City's total waste is organics. So that means food scraps or soiled paper, yard waste, stuff like that. And I started to learn as I was doing this research that how we deal with our waste is incredibly damaging to underserved and underrepresented communities. These inequities that exist in the system are largely for Black and Brown communities. I learned that hundreds of thousands of tons of NYC garbage ends up in Black and Brown neighborhoods in other states. And then a third of all of NYC garbage ends up in the South Bronx. And so as I was doing this research and learning from people who are really experts in this and in New York City's composting community, it became really clear that as we compost every pound of food scraps that we're able to compost locally and process locally, it helps to alleviate some of the disparities that we see in these communities of color when it comes to our waste management. And that's in truck traffic. Sometimes New York garbage is trucked as far away as North Carolina. It affects the air quality, the rodents, the vermin. So these communities are really suffering from the way that we deal with our waste. This environmental activist named Jessie Taylor Cruz, she says that composting is one way to directly combat environmental injustice. She says that composting is one way to not only help keep waste out of chronically disenfranchised communities, but it is also a form of protest and resistance against racist policies that allow for our garbage to pollute marginalized communities.
Michael, that's fantastic. Often in environmental movements, the issue of garbage as such is not addressed enough, and I'm really pleased that you talked about that. I had a question for you about working and being employed during the COVID crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're at with that?
Absolutely. So I said at the beginning, I'm an actor by trade. I do Broadway stuff, regional theater, and then TV and film stuff as well. And obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, our industry was just decimated. So I've been through small jobs here and there within the last couple months of the pandemic. But really, the pandemic unemployment assistance has been keeping me afloat until right now. So we're fighting for that pandemic unemployment assistance to kick back in.
If you were to describe your relationship to the environment in one word, what would that be and why?
I think that a lot of people get overwhelmed with how big of an issue climate change is and climate justice and the environment, and how ingrained some of these habits we have are, and how damaging some of these habits can be that we are really ingrained in our daily lives. So I try and talk about it with my friends and loved ones in a way that feels manageable. I think if we can all commit to just learning learning more about this and learning better, I think that's the first step to making some serious progress.
Michael, thank you so very much for joining us again with the New York Renew Story-Based Project, and have a great evening.